You are listening to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armenian. When states deny atrocities, and particularly genocide, they complicate the healing process for its survivors. Why should Turkey acknowledge the Armenian genocide? Some argue it's for the sake of its own country and democracy. Doug Becker explores.
I'm Doug Becker. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, we focused on acknowledgment, commemoration, reparations, restitution, and other forms of ways in which we address genocide and mass atrocity. This week, we turn our attention to denial, when the perpetrators deny that they have committed atrocities and genocide, what this means, and how they construct the denial. Last week, to commemorate the start of the Ottoman genocide against Armenians, US President Joe Biden officially acknowledged the genocide. He is the first US president to do so. Typically cited as the reason why US presidents are reluctant to acknowledge this genocide was the complications it would cause to US-Turkish relations, because Turkey continues to deny the genocide. On today's show, we explore why the nation denies committing genocide and what forms the denial takes. We will also explore the implications on US-Turkish relations. Our guest is Fatma Göçek, a professor of sociology and women's studies at the University of Michigan. Her most recent publication is The Denial of Violence: Ottoman Past, Turkish Present, and the Collective Violence Against Armenians, 1789 to 2009. Professor Göçek, thank you very much for joining us. My first question, when reviewing reactions to the president's acknowledgement of the Ottoman genocide against Armenians, I frequently came across comments like, why is Turkey so upset about the US acknowledgement? It was the Ottoman Empire who committed this genocide, not Turkey. So my question to you is, why is Turkey so upset?
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here with you to discuss this issue. You are absolutely right. That was actually the reason why I wrote the book. Initially, I said to myself, as a Turkish citizen, I said, this is something that happened in the past, so we can just move on. And then I realized it wasn't that easy. And I mean, I wish it were that easy, but it is very complicated. The main reason is the continuity between the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic in terms of the staffing of the officials and officers. Basically, what happened with the establishment of the Turkish Republic is that many of the former perpetrators became the heroes of the Turkish Republic that was founded. And then they were able to whitewash their past and silence totally the violence, the atrocities they did in the past. For example, we're talking very high-level people, such as the second president and the first prime minister, actually, is İsmet İnönü. He was the head of the special organization, Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa, the paramilitary organizations that actually went and destroyed the Armenians. And then, of course, he became, as I said, the president. There is another president who came after İnönü. First, he was also a member of the secret organization of violence, and he too was involved in persecuting actually Greek Rum who lived along the Aegean Peninsula. So in a way, the main issue is that this is a foundational violence of the Turkish Republic, and if it were to be acknowledged, Turks are afraid, I guess more Turkish officials are afraid that the foundations of the Republic will crumble because everything has to be rewritten. And also, in addition, of course, there is nationalism, and there is the argument that the Turkish Republic was formed with the blood, sweat, and tears of the Turks, not the blood, sweat, and tears of the Armenians. And that, of course, will also change stories. And they are worried, I think, that there will be no Turkey to talk about. But I, on the other hand, think that denial is destructive. morally especially. It destroys the moral fabric of a society, as Eviatar Zerubbabel discussed in his book called Elephant in the Room, which is a fascinating book. So I think that is the main reason. There are too many continuities, and many of the business people or the wealthy in Turkey today, unfortunately, base their wealth on the properties, goods, wealth of Armenians, Greeks, and some Jews as well.
So I know certain countries have acknowledged atrocities. We had Elazar Barkan on 2 weeks ago in his wonderful book, Guilt of Nations, wrestles with why certain countries might acknowledge this. I think of Germany's at least restitution, even though there was no apology to Israel. The Australian acknowledgement of genocide is a couple of examples of this. What benefits do you see that Turkey could receive if they were to acknowledge? In particular, I know there's a challenge with respect to restitution and land return, etc. But if it was just an acknowledgement without any material, offers of restitution and reparations, could that? What kind of benefit could Turkey get from that?
Well, I make the argument in my book that Turkey will not be a democratic country if it does not acknowledge the genocide, because what happens is that these people, the perpetrators who were then the rulers, let's say, of the republic or the elite of the republic, what did they learn from this lesson? They were able to carry out mass atrocities. They not only got away with it and were not held accountable for it, but they actually were rewarded because they became the elite of this new country. So as a consequence, they do not believe that there is interest of humanity, or that there ought to be things that ought to be used in solving, in discussing, or diplomacy and such. Since they were able to very successfully solve the problem through violence, they then attack every problem that emerges with violence. I mean, a case in point is the Kurds. The Kurds are the major, as you know, the most significant minority, and they are constantly under violence and attack because, I argue, of what had happened before to the Armenians. The same people who were the perpetrators then were also involved in oppressing the Kurds. So there is the continuity, unfortunately. So by acknowledgement, then, and hopefully holding people accountable, obviously most of them have died, but nevertheless, just to sort of rhetorically at least, by holding them accountable, there will be this sense that violence is not just easily committed. You are held responsible for it, and then there will be rule of law rather than rule of violence, which is what we have in Turkey today.
You've referenced this the foundational narrative or even foundational myth of the creation of modern Turkey. The group that we in the West, identify with the founders of the state are the so-called Young Turks. How much is that narrative, this modernizing force, how much does that play a role in the modern identity of Turkey, in particular because, as many Turkish scholars have pointed out, one person who has, I don't believe, ever individually been indicted for a connection with the genocide is the actual father of modern Turkey, Mustafa Kemal or Ataturk. Since Ataturk isn't blamed for this, does that give a certain leeway for Turkey to recast the narrative of the Young Turk Foundation?
It would technically, because Mustafa Kemal was an Ottoman general. I mean, he was a part of the elite cadre of the Young Turks. He was a Young Turk himself. Fortunately for him, what happened is that during World War I, because Enver Pasha, who was one of the other leaders of the Young Turks, because Enver Pasha was jealous of Ataturk and didn't want Ataturk there, he actually sent him away from where the genocide was taking place so that he wasn't involved by chance. And the other thing, though, is that because he was founding a new republic and needed especially top-level soldiers and officers, he allowed people who the British government, the occupying forces in Istanbul at the time, were starting to track down the genocide perpetrator officers and officials. He welcomed all of them into his circle because he needed people with skills, military skills, to win the war. They say that he has always kept them at a distance, but nevertheless, they were also his friends and the cadre that surrounded him. So as a consequence, it's sort of, let's say his record is not 100% clear. He was, one could say, by association, he obviously sort of was there. The other thing is, of course, when he took a stand about the Armenians, he had two different stands. He had the public consumption for the Western countries, and he also had another consumption for the Turkish citizens. With the Turkish citizens, he would say, these are minorities, they have no place here, this is our country, this is the country of the Turks. But then when he was talking to the foreign press, he would always talk about, oh, they are here, we will include them, we will treat them equally, and we have no animosity towards them. And that's what we know, of course. Now we can compare the two. And probably all those factors come together to make it quite difficult.
So Stovil Budrite has an even more descriptive term when she speaks of inside-out memory versus outside-in memory. So it's fair to say that the narratives that Turkey advances explaining what happened starting in 1915 really differ when they're addressing international communities versus communities within Turkey. At the end of the day, how is this narrative constructed to external communities? How is it explained that, something that, historians agree upon was there was mass death during the period, but that it's somehow not genocide?
My argument is that this is a duplicitous stand that starts with Western European modernity from the late 18th century onwards, where there are these sort of different ways. The traditional and the modern are constantly in conflict with one another. And it is probably that conflict that sort of has led this narrative. Basically, they say, Turks are not capable of, Turks are human like anybody else. I don't think we have any privilege when it comes to moral issues or anyone else. So that's one thing. The other thing is Turks died as well. And what they say, well, more Turks died than Armenians, and the Armenians killed them all. And for that, they look at the number of Turkish soldiers who died, and it is around 2.5 million. As you know, the First World War was extremely bloody and destructive. So they say, 1.5 million, 2 million Turks died, and Armenians killed them. No, these died at war, at the frontier. They are soldiers who died. Of course, when you're talking about Armenians, you cannot equate the two because the Armenians were civilians. There were some in the labor battalions. They also died, elderly, women, children. So you cannot compare. But that's what they're doing. They're basically recreating false truths, which don't exist, unfortunately.
You're listening to Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Doug Becker. We're discussing the construction and causes of Turkey's denial of the Armenian genocide with Fatma Göçek of the University of Michigan. Professor Göçek, I always like to ask, when thinking about these questions of memory, what's at stake internationally? In particular, part of your book emphasizes the fact that the history of the Ottoman Empire with non-Turkish populations is one that frequently is described by violence. And you referenced the Kurds, for example, which we know is an ongoing issue about Kurdish representation or the possibility of an independent Kurdish state. Is that one of the issues that's at stake I know Armenians as well have spoken quite a bit about land restoration with respect to this. Is that ultimately what's at stake, or is this more kind of a conceptual identity sort of question for Turks?
If you think about it, now we're in the third generation. So technically, the first generation has died, but nevertheless, they have left, of course, their deeds, the title deeds and such. In Turkey, to this day, it's the Ministry of the Interior that has the title deeds, and you cannot research. You have to get permission from the military to get the title deeds and the history, because if they did allowed it, then people could see for themselves which places have been confiscated. Most of the Armenians were part of the Ottoman bourgeoisie that was emerging at that time. As a consequence, in many towns, they had the nicest buildings. They also were known for their stonework and steelwork and such, and that, of course, is ironwork, and that's also beautiful. So most of them either were turned over to the state and they became hospitals, schools, and in a way they were preserved. In one or two cases, museums. Of course, most of the churches were destroyed or they became mosques instead. So I think you could probably track it down and ask, and there have been at least some lawsuits. So that is one possibility. Restitution financially, of course, is another issue. Because what happened was when the Turkish Republic was founded, they initially didn't want to acknowledge that they were the descendants of the Ottoman Empire. But then, of course, the issue of all the palaces and all the wealth that belonged to the Sultan came about. And then Turks acknowledged that legacy and paid reparations, I think, to the Allied forces for the war for quite a while after that, like the Germans did. So yes, that probably is an issue. For me, I couldn't care less about any of that because it is material things. I'm much more interested in the moral ethical dimension of it because it is very sad for me to see how denial is the last stage, literally, of genocide because Armenians are stuck in history. When I talk to Armenians today, they talk about 1915 as if it happened yesterday. That's because they haven't been able to grieve because it's not acknowledged. Elazar Barkan and I were once talking at UCLA, and he said to the Armenians, he said, look, you're getting all these countries to accept the genocide. He said, but there's one country whose acceptance will make all the difference. That's Turkey. I mean, the rest of them, it's great, but, they don't have much power, right? I mean, over Turkey at least. So he said, why don't you just start the negotiations? And Armenians wouldn't hear of it because, they're not going to negotiate whether the genocide happened or not, because that's the ultimate insult to what has happened. So that is why I think it's going to be very difficult. In Turkey, though, there are many people like me. They're even more courageous because they live in Turkey. And civil society, basically. And the younger generation, of course, have more access to everything, and they have a better sense of what's going on. Even some friends of mine who are political scientists say that, Turkey acts as if the genocide has happened. It's just trying to control the reverberations of it in a way. And if you go to Turkey and travel in what used to be Armenia, and I've done that for 5 summers to get a sense, when you talk to the people there, they say, informally, they say, yes, we took the Armenians, we killed them in that, well, and then we threw them down the ditch. It's all there. But of course, none of that makes it to the state level. The other thing they could also do is talk about righteous Turks. There were also many Turks who protected the Armenians or who saved them. So we could highlight them. That may be another way to do that.
Reminds me of just how popular Schindler's List was in Germany, to remind people of precisely that same issue. I was struck by years ago in conversations with Turkish colleagues of mine back in the middle part of the first decade, 2004, 2005, when the US was first passing resolutions, through the House and through the Senate on the acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide. As to the interpretation, particularly in Turkey, about why the US was doing this. I assumed it was in part because Armenian Americans had gained political strength and they had allies in Congress that had been particularly effective at advancing these issues. But my colleague from Turkey said, oh, we assumed you were just punishing us for not allowing Turkish bases to be used for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So I guess this is part of this multiplicity of narratives. It's in that in mind that I ask, when President Biden acknowledges the Armenian genocide, there's a context here, certainly. The so-called neo-Ottoman foreign policy coming out of Turkey, the aggression in places like the Eastern Mediterranean, certainly support for Azerbaijani aggression in Nagorno-Karabakh. How much is that Turkey's interpretation? This is the U.S. Being upset with Turkish foreign policy or perhaps with President Erdogan versus kind of a bigger, broader issue?
In order to, of course, argue that it's baseless, they have to show that the U.S. has real national interests itself, and that's why it's doing it. Fortunately or unfortunately, ever since 9/11, because of course, the proximity of Turkey to the region, the bases there were especially important. And as a consequence, both in 2003 intervention and then, later ones, it made a big difference whether they could fly from Turkey, from the bases there or not. And initially, there was a vote against it because that was when Justice and Development Party had just come to power. And they said, vote in accordance with what you think, with respect to your heart, what your heart tells you to do. The heart told people not to let the Americans use the bases, which was terrible because, as you probably know, then they had to go literally around the Horn of Africa, come. And in the meanwhile, many of the armaments they had became rusty because of the humidity and everything, and that really put them back a lot. Of course, ever since that, we've realized that Erdogan is being very, as you said, neo-Ottoman and such, and he also bought planes, as you probably know, S-400s from Russia as well. So as a consequence, at this point, also Biden wants to get out of Afghanistan and Iraq too. So I don't think they need the bases as much as they did before, or at least the price they pay for having the bases is no longer viable. And that's why I think we got the acknowledgement this time around.
Now, you had highlighted one of the issues that are at stake in Turkey is Turkey's democratization. And a very specific instance of this, you've made references to this, I want to make sure to ask about this, are scholars who work on this issue, on issues, the foundation of the Turkish state, and any sort of criticism of the government. President Erdogan is becoming increasingly authoritarian, and I know of stories of academics facing political sanction, including imprisonment. I guess first, how serious is that as a challenge within Turkey, and how much is this a convenient issue for President Erdogan to simply get rid of, imprison academics that might challenge him politically?
Well, unfortunately, I haven't been able to go back to Turkey since 2015. For 6 years, I'm out because I signed a peace declaration on behalf of the Kurds, asking the Turkish state not to kill them, but to negotiate with them and to acknowledge them. So as a consequence, I can't go back. Most of my friends are in prison, unfortunately. And others are self-censoring and not talking about these things. That's the only way out. And also legally, if you acknowledge the genocide in Turkey, you can be imprisoned up to 1.5 years. If you are a Turkish citizen and you acknowledge it outside of Turkey, it is 3 years. And if you're a Turk like me living outside of Turkey and acknowledging it, it's 4.5 years in prison. They haven't used it, to my knowledge, yet to imprison people, but they always can, and you never know whether they would or not. There is no freedom of expression and thought in Turkey. There never was. And that, I think, is one of the problems. They also see academics, all the universities, as if they were government bureaucrats or officials. They do not get the notion that you can be there and you can think whatever you want. That's not possible. They always say, if you do say something, it's against the unity of the Turkish state, then they try you for treason. And then it doesn't look good, unfortunately.
So my final question, I think it's fair to say it's unlikely that Turkey would acknowledge the Armenian genocide or violence against communities, violence against Greeks, violence against Kurds, etc., during this period under the current president, under President Erdogan. But do you have any optimism that over the course of, say, the next, 10 to 20 years, we could see some shift in Turkey's willingness to acknowledge genocide, or at least create a real open, vibrant dialogue within Turkey about whether or not it was genocide as opposed to the current repression?
I once used to be very optimistic. I no longer am. The optimism sort of got destroyed in 2007 with the assassination of Hrant Dink, who was an Armenian journalist in Turkey of Armenian origin. And what is important about that is that to this day, they have the person who killed the assassin, but they cannot and they did not catch or actually try those who gave the orders, who came within the military. We know that. And it came also within the bureaucracy, called the deep state in a way. They're still there. And if it's not accounted for, that's the first thing I would like to see happen. But I'm not very optimistic. The other opening could have been if the Kurds joined politics. Initially, they did join the Turkish political system. They were elected. And they also, because Kurds were usually the intermediaries who actually massacred the Armenians, especially in the southeast, they have apologized, all of them, the civil society organizations. Then we're in parliament. I said, great, maybe things will change. Well, guess what? They're now all imprisoned. So I don't know what would go. With them in prison, there is no democracy. And I'm not optimistic. I have no idea where it could come. The only thing going for it is social media, education is increasing, and maybe civil society will eventually say, hey, this doesn't make sense. But we don't have a strong civil society to counter the state. And whenever they try to do, they're always decimated. Newspapers are closed. All the ones, most of them are owned by Erdogan's sycophants. So I'm not, unfortunately, optimistic.
And sadly, I think I share that lack of optimism, though certainly the president's acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide, I've gotten more questions over the course of the last week to 2 weeks from students. What is the Armenian genocide? Can you tell me what he was talking about? And so if it's done nothing else, it's opened up new lines of communication and ways to educate about the history in the region and this horrible, horrible history of genocide against the Armenian people.
Actually, now the US ambassadors will be able to talk about this as genocide. They weren't able to. And even, as you probably know, one of the US ambassadors to Armenia had to leave his position because he called it a genocide, John Evans. And since that, at least, and the US is a superpower, so I think with power comes authority. Maybe, yes, the truth will come out more easily. Who knows?
We can always be optimistic on that. We've been discussing Turkey's denial of the Ottoman genocide against the Armenians, the impact of President Biden's acknowledgement, and the construction of denial narratives. Our guest has been Fatma Göçek, who is the professor of sociology and women's studies at the University of Michigan. Her publications include Social Constructions of Nationalism in the Middle East, The Transformation of Turkey, Redefining State and Society from the Ottoman Empire to the Modern Era, and her latest book, which addresses this issue directly, Denial of Violence, Ottoman Past, Turkish Present, and Collective Violence Against the Armenians, 1789 to 2009. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to our guest and to you for listening. The Scholars Circle team includes Doug Becker and Lillian Ng, contributing hosts, Akine Aghassian and Melissa Chiprin, managing producers. Sud Dongre, our webmaster, Tim Page and Mike Hurst, engineers and technical support. I'm Maria Armoudian, and we'll see you next week.